Welcome to Precinct 444, the podcast where we explore the most pressing issues in law enforcement today. I'm your host, Josh Bronson, Director of Education, Programs, and Visitor Experience at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. In this episode, titled Standardizing Justice, Rethinking Sexual Assault Response in Law Enforcement, we're diving into one of the most critical challenges facing our profession: how to create a consistent, trauma-informed approach to sexual assault investigations. Joining me are two incredible guests: Senior Investigator Matthew Stegner, who's retired from the New York State Police, a seasoned law enforcement professional and national trainer, and Michael Rizzo, a nationally recognized subject matter expert on intimate partner violence. Together, we'll explore why standardization matters, the role of leadership, and how law enforcement can build trust with survivors. Let's get started. So first off, Matt, I'm going to turn to you. Can you explain what a trauma-informed approach looks like in practice? We hear that term a lot: trauma-informed this, trauma-informed that, but what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it definitely is a term that was not around the vast majority of my active law enforcement career. It's picked up traction, as you know, and as Michael knows, here the past several years, which is a good thing. For me, the term trauma-informed is not just being victim-centered or conducting your investigation in a way that makes sure we honor these disclosures that occur from victims of sexual assault, but understanding or not losing your way if the disclosure is not exactly what you think should have happened or what you think you would have done in that same situation. So it's an interesting problem, if you want to call it, or situation with law enforcement where the individuals that are candidates to become police officers, the ones that make it through to our ranks the easiest, in my experience, are the ones that haven't grown up around a lot of criminality or chaos, and by proxy don't commit a lot of criminality or chaos. So the starting point for a lot of us in law enforcement is at an extreme disadvantage because we cannot relate to the victim side of things, cannot relate to the offender side of things, hopefully. And that starting point is often fraught with issues when we utilize the lens of what we think should happen. So for me, a trauma-informed approach is understanding the defense cascade, understanding brain-based behaviors that occur when a traumatic event happens, in this instance, sexual assault, and not losing your way as it relates to confusion or frustration of what did or didn't happen by the survivor.
Great. Well, and Michael, we've known each other since 2013, sometime around then. And the first time I met you was talking about trauma. And when I was an officer, I had the ability to attend some of the trauma-informed trainings that you were running through some national providers, the OVW funded Office on Violence Against Women funded events. And what I took away from those classes really shaped, how I went about the rest of my career in law enforcement and then after. And so I'm wondering, when it comes to this trauma-informed approach that we're talking about, and, based on what Matt just said, how have you seen trauma-informed practices sort of change over time throughout your career? And how have you been a part of that?
Sure. Thank you, Josh. Thanks for the question. I have been part of many training and technical assistance efforts with law enforcement across the country for many, many years. And I've always looked to really my advocacy background, doing direct service work, to think about what that taught me about what trauma is and how we recognize and respond to trauma in individuals. It's thinking about creating safe environments and building trust and transparency and communication and cultural considerations, and building those into agency law enforcement response on an individual level and an agency level, whether it's in policy or procedures. And I continue to think about and worked on how we build that into agencies. And I think we were seeing and are seeing, I was, in my past roles, seeing a lot of departments putting those ideas into place and really operationalizing those when it comes to victim response.
And, the inconsistencies and things like that, I think that's, one of the big questions that we really want to sort of dive into today. Or, there have been these inconsistencies in how trauma-informed approach has been implemented. Matt, your time at the New York State Police gave you firsthand experience to a lot of those inconsistencies. So talk a little bit about what can we do to sort of change those inconsistencies? You talk a lot about standardization of a trauma-informed approach. What does that look like to you, and why do you think that's so critical?
Yeah, so I'm just such a firm believer that it shouldn't matter what zip code a survivor resides in, that the response is predicated on that. And, other crimes like driving while intoxicated, driving under the influence, damage to property or criminal mischief, the response is generally standardized. But for whatever reason, around sexual assault, intimate partner violence, the response varies greatly. I think a really great starting point is advocacy. I think, and I know firsthand, that if we could just nationwide include advocacy in our response with that victim interview, it'd be just such a great starting point. When I hear things like we don't use community-based advocates, we only use our in-house advocates, or we don't use any advocates at all, it's certainly quite frustrating. And I know from firsthand experience, as somebody that did years and years of investigating, not using advocates, and then later kind of finding my way and conducting victims interviews with advocates present, the highest grade or the highest rank that I can put on an investigative standard is it's what I would want to have happen if, God forbid, something happened to one of my loved ones, would be a well-prepared and trained police officer with an advocate present in the room during that victim interview. So the starting point of just utilizing our friends in advocacy is just the foundational layer. And what I'm really hoping will become the standard, just like standardized field sobriety tests or just like a breath test. And it just becomes the norm and not the exception.
Yeah. Well, you talk about advocates and Michael, you as well, and your background, Michael, even and I'm often reminded when having these conversations about advocates, just how much has changed over the years. I remember, so I was a campus police officer and an investigator, and I worked at the same school that I had attended. And just a quick story, but I when I started my first year at that institution, I remember the training that we all received in sexual assault response and prevention. And the head of the advocacy center on campus stood up and told us not to report to the police, specifically told us not to report to the police because they couldn't be trusted, basically. And by the time I left the institution, I was the deputy chief, and that very same advocate was calling me in my office to meet with students, one-on-one, because we developed such a great trust and rapport. And I think it's through programs like, the ones, Michael, that you helped develop over your years that really made those changes. And, having seen those changes firsthand, we have a long way to go, certainly, and that's just one instance of that. But Michael, I wonder if you have anything you want to add on those types of changes that you've seen over the years.
Well, I do, and I want to go back to kind of reflect on what Matt was saying and the inconsistencies. And I think there should be a standard. There should be some type of core principles put into place. But I do think these cases can be very fluid. And I do think that there needs to be the ability to understand that you're meeting each person where they're at. And that might change the way the investigation's done or the response. So it can't be A directly to F process, it might be all over the place. I know we've all talked about that before, about really understanding, giving the choice and the empowerment to the victim and making sure that they are part of how the investigation goes. I don't know if Matt wants to speak to that at all. But I do think there are some core principles that need to be put in place, and that will create more of a consistent response across the board, like Matt said, to DWIs or DUIs. And I think, we've seen, and I know Matt and I have talked about the consistency also of being who you connect with and contact at police departments. It shouldn't just be one person or one unit that has this understanding and has the tools and the knowledge to understand trauma and what trauma-informed investigation looks like. It needs to be a kind of a holistic department-wide thing. And I know we've had a lot of conversations about that, about how do you train up and create an entire culture in the agency that is trauma-informed.
Well, so let's talk about culture, because I think culture is really at the heart of the matter. A lot of issues in policing today, a lot of topics we could discuss. I mean, it comes down to culture of the department and how things are implemented, and the buy-in that agencies have, that officers have, comes from the top. But the top can't just change culture on a dime either. So talk a little bit about culture, Matt, your experience.
Yeah, it's interesting, and Michael's right as far as the standardization goes. You can't standardize an investigation on the human experience. There's themes and concepts and principles certainly that I think should be adopted each and every time. But, she's exactly right. You have to be able to move like water, be nimble, be creative, and be ethical, certainly. As it relates to culture, it is interesting. We've seen this with response to child abuse, child molestation, and the advent of the first child advocacy center in Alabama. And CACs, or child advocacy centers, are just about everywhere. Some locations have to travel. I understand that. But the idea of the police officer doing the interview in the kitchen with the 5-year-old, with the offender in the other room, we've really moved away from that. It is interesting when our survivors turn 18, that's all gone. That we now are still doing some interviews in the interrogation room, some interviews without an advocate present, interviews by individuals not trained, such as the forensic interview friends that we have in child advocacy. So an extension of those principles is really what I'd like to see, but that, because there's no standardization like the Child Advocacy Center, needs to come from the top. In my experience, when I see a great response to child abuse, child exploitation, sexual assault, I usually see a great department. And it's two-prong test, an amazing response at that victim interview that are really tough and can be really challenging, but also a high energy, high effort investigation that does right by that disclosure, that doesn't guess or play what I call home run ball, which is this issue is this disclosure is fraught with challenges, fraught with credibility issues. It's not going anywhere. I'm going to make this call, and instead taking shortcuts and not running the investigation the way it should be. But that only comes from leadership. It comes from a standard, and that is driven from the top down. The 3-4 line police reports are not going to be accepted. Individuals, officers on the response level, we're not going to accept anything less than a robust trauma-informed interview, but that has to come from the top. And it's difficult, but we've seen it before, and definitely not impossible.
Yeah.
Matt, can I ask Matt a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. So through all the work I was doing across the country with leaders of different agencies, small and large, rural, tribal, you name it, one of the things we heard a lot was how many competing priorities there were for leaders to put into place. And I do agree that this needs to be prioritized, and the training and resources need to go into this. But can you talk, and Josh, definitely, you've spent time with law enforcement leaders over your career, but there's always this sense of, little resources, lack of resources, and a lot of priorities. How do we put this forward, to, as we, getting back to your original question, Josh, talk about the culture of the agency. It's got to start from the top. But how do we do this with competing priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Yeah, I was actually thinking something along the same lines too. And I think, Michael, I think this is one of the challenges of policing in general, right? There are always competing priorities for everything, and and they're all important. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, DUI enforcement is extremely important. Learning field sobriety tests is extremely important. Learning how to respond to active assailants and active shooters, right? Extremely important. I think we need to do a better job. And Matt, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too, of breaking down the silos between all of our different types of responses. Because a trauma-informed response, to me, should be implemented across the board. Like, you should be trauma-informed in every single thing that you do in a police agency. So if you start with it as being the norm and you simply add on a sexual assault response, these are some specific things that you need to do in a sexual assault case. These are some specific things you need to do in an active assailant case, in a robbery case. But if we start everything from a trauma-informed lens, it all becomes easier. One of the things I used to tell people is practice being trauma-informed when you're going on a call for a break-in. Practice it when you're going on a vandalism of a vehicle, right? Because you don't know that car might be the person's lifeline to the outside world, and now they can't drive it because their cars have been slashed and they don't have money to buy new tires, right? So everything, I think, if we start from a trauma-informed lens, then I think it makes adding on all of the different individual pieces a little bit easier.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as far as competing interests, I want to push back on that a bit. My entire career, I believe, is similar to a lot of other police agencies where I was in a general investigations unit, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. I was in a specialized unit for a couple of years, but the majority of our brothers and sisters in law enforcement are handling a multitude of crimes. Yes, there's special victims units that we see on TV or some of the larger municipalities. I am here to say that it made me a better, having a trauma-informed approach to any crime made me a better professional. It made me a more successful professional. And by proxy, I believe it made me a better person. So you're right, Josh and Michael, this isn't a skill that's limited to just sexual assault or intimate partner violence, but instead an ethos or a way of thinking that I believe really is helpful and can help officers have a purpose-driven life that they're looking for professionally. I don't, as a trainer, possess this magical set of skills that are used for sexual assault investigations. The themes are pretty standard, pretty common, but it's the mindset and it's the honoring of the disclosure and knowing what you're doing as relates to a safety plan, connecting them with advocacy that I see us getting in a lot of trouble with. So competing interests, sure, always going to have it. There's certainly, the dirty little secret, there's no federal money or funds behind sexual assault, unlike truck inspection, counterterrorism, things of that nature. So I understand that, but, I encourage anyone listening to fast forward to your ending, and you're going to see these people again. You're going to see these people that for a moment in time reached their hand out and needed a hand. And it's not a great feeling when you didn't bring it. And I know I have some of those instances in my history for sure. In fairness, I went through 2 police academies and I never learned how to do a victim interview as a starting point. So.
No, and that's the sad reality too, right? We teach interviewing very often. There are places where it's changing, but historically we've taught interviewing as suspect interviewing in the academy, or everybody's a suspect basically. And here are the tools that you need to interview, which those are important skills. Not saying you shouldn't teach those or anything like that. But I mean, I've taught in numerous police academies, and it's always, oh yeah, you have about 3 hours to teach everything you need to know about being trauma informed and also
Sure.
sexual assault, and also domestic violence and also stalking. And so that can be, I think, a real challenge, when you're not starting off with those skills. You're adding on later, and you're not building off of them. I mean, when you're in the police academy, that's the time where you're absorbing the most. That's the time where you're sucking in the most information that you possibly can. That should be the time where we're really trying to make a lot of these changes. And Michael, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that too, because I know you've worked with, not just from the advocacy side, but in your work with law enforcement, leaders from around the world. What your thoughts are on that as well, and sort of turning the question back around to you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think, Matt, and you both said it well, of this being trauma informed shouldn't be designated to one specific space or crime. It should be an agency-wide value or, work that we do. It should just be interacting with humans in a way where we're communicating, we're building trust, we're building a relationship, there's rapport. That should be, like Matt said, any case, anything that law enforcement respond to. And I do think integrating more of this into academy training would be fantastic. I mean, I've heard many, many times, how small the window of time is that is dedicated to victim interviewing, and how much more work is done, Josh, like you said, on interrogations or suspect interviews. But I do think, again, going back to the just basics of advocacy, of creating spaces to talk to people and create safe spaces and an environment where they're going to trust you. I mean, that should be on every interaction, every call, every connect with a community member, not just in sexual assault cases. So I do think that's a cultural change that needs to happen and is slowly shifting in many agencies. And we see it happening, but I feel like we're still really applying it to a small number of cases or interactions, and it's not really being looked at as a whole across the board for agencies.
Yeah. So when we talk about, how do we then standardize it, going back to the conversation around standardization. So how do we start to standardize what that looks like? Because as Michael pointed out, cases are, fluid, and they do change, and there isn't a one size fits all for every single type of sexual assault case. But that's not to say that there isn't room for that standardization too, like you and Michael also said, Matt. So how do we develop that, I guess, is the question. How do we build that out so that there can be the standardization without it also being that one size fits all?
Yeah, I think there's some great principles or starting points. I understand that there's times that the disclosures occur, not as walk-ins to the station. So it can't always be a soft interview room with an advocate present, with the door open, with a bottle of water. I understand that. I really think 4 core principles that the initial response would be exceptionally helpful. And that would be for officers to first make sure the victim's health and connecting them to health care is the top of mind. Making sure that they understand how many hours in their jurisdiction this individual has to get hopefully free resources for this situation. Understanding if they showered or not, if that's irrelevant, and having a real working knowledge of that. I'm not proud of this, but I spoke at a recent police academy. I asked of the 200 recruits, how many of them knew how many hours a survivor had to get a sex offense evidence collection kit, and nobody knew. With that first priority of healthcare, in line would be hopefully some physical evidence. If we get it, great. If we don't, that's okay too, because the victim's health is top of mind. Second core principle is connecting them to advocacy early. And I mean more than a pamphlet. I mean a face-to-face encounter, hopefully, or a professional connection. The third is a safety plan, asking the survivor, do you feel safe? We know if you look at the data in the first 24 hours after survivors report, especially in intimate partner violence, exceptionally deadly for the victim, especially for women. And the fourth principle is making sure you follow up with your survivor and keep them posted. One of the main complaints, Josh and Michael, I get nationally is I can't get a hold of my detective. The prosecutor won't call me back. My detective got promoted and nobody told me who's in charge of my case. I've left 3 messages. Those 4 core principles at the initial response: healthcare, physical evidence, connection to advocacy, safety plan, and robust follow-up as a starting point. I really can't see a scenario, no matter how many challenges are with your survivor, that can't be implemented each and every time.
When we, the connection to advocacy, I think, in particular is something that, again, over time has shifted. We have better relationships in law enforcement now with advocates and vice versa. I think I know, I still hear from law enforcement that, our relationship could be better. And I hear from advocates that our relationship could be better. And it's sort of interesting that everybody sort of thinks that it could be better. And yet we still have all these sort of frustrations and challenges. I wonder, Michael, in the work that you've done, how have you seen, what have you seen that works as far as building those relationships and really getting people to understand, that it's not a side that we're on. We're not on opposite sides. We have specific job tasks that we need to do. And so how do we get, folks who are advocates to see the job of law enforcement? How do we get law enforcement to see the job of advocates? And how do we get them to work complementary?
Yeah, I mean, it takes work, right? It's like any relationship, it takes work, but it's worth it, and it's worth a healthy relationship with advocates and, medical partners, faith-based communities, whatever community organizations can help. It comes in all shapes and forms of very informal relationships, of knowing who your sexual assault advocates are, your domestic violence advocates are, and having them on, their phone number in your phone, and you're able to text them and call them. And it's more formal with structured sexual assault response teams, domestic violence response teams, whatever it is, whatever it looks like in your community or, campus or region, wherever you are. It's transparency and it's understanding shared goals, in my opinion, and shared missions, and understanding what everyone's roles and responsibilities are to get there. So like I said, it takes work. You have to understand why everyone's doing what they do, what their role is. There's a lot of, confidentiality or privilege that sometimes becomes a challenge for law enforcement to understand, or for advocates to understand why information can't be shared in certain cases. So it's again, sitting down and making sure you have those relationships to talk to one another, and get on the same page to get to the goal that you're working for. Also, though, thinking about going back to the culture idea and the agency culture, just thinking about leaders. And I think leaders have a lot to do with the partners and the collaboration, and not just internal in the agency of what's going on with the culture of the agency, but that will help build out the agency and find those other partners and sustain those partnerships in a healthy way. So I do think that leaders in the department, whether they're, the named leaders, the chiefs, the assistant chiefs, whatever, or those kind of informal people that are taking lead or coaching or mentoring to build these relationships.
Yeah. Well, and, I wonder too, Michael, over, the course of your career too, I mean, you built training programs and beyond training programs. I mean, really, how to shift culture within agencies and, leadership institutes and, things like that for law enforcement. And I'm wondering how you see some of those principles that you helped develop over the years, playing into this conversation. I mean, there was so much culture change that happened, within just those sort of cohorts, if you will, of police leaders from around the country and around the world. And I'm just wondering how you see that playing in.
Yeah, I think it goes back to relationships, right? Like, we put trainers in front of the room, in front of law enforcement who represented various disciplines, to start to show law enforcement that we need all those people. We need the prosecutors, we need the advocates, we need the medical personnel, we need all these different people to come together to do this, to do it right, and to do it, holistically. And they can help within the agency with policy updates, with procedure updates, with going out on ride-alongs, with helping with interviews, with being part of development of SOPs, whatever it is. I think that's a lot of what it came down to was, looking at the coaching, the mentoring, and the building of each other, but by each other, of different disciplines.
And Matt, picking up on that, what have you seen that has worked well to build those specific relationships with advocates or, other groups that maybe we historically in law enforcement, we haven't had, great relationships with for one reason or another, not casting blame on anyone, but how do you build those relationships?
Yeah, in my experience, it's just like any other professional relationship. In my opinion, if you want to be great at your profession, you have to be willing to work with some natural tension. So what I mean by that is I could put a mirror in an interview room that's going to sit there silently and not say anything. That's easy. But if you want to challenge yourself as a law enforcement professional, an advocate brings that different perspective. I know when I was really trying to get to that mastery level of victim interviewing, I would call the advocate on my way leaving the interview and ask, usually her, what do you think? What could I have done better? Hey, maybe, it felt like it ran a little bit long. Maybe next time we could interrupt and do a break. I saw she was really staring at you writing notes, and maybe you could just explain why you were jotting things down. And that was really my start towards wanting to get to a mastery level on victim interviewing. So, long-winded answer to your question, but the relationship building is not unlike any other professional relationship, either law enforcement with nurses, doctors, prosecutors. It takes time. It means answering the phone. It means being available. Of course, there's professional boundaries, but if they have a law enforcement question, taking the time to ask them. And I will say, it's just my individual micro sample size, that as a law enforcement professional, when you gain a reputation of being a victim interviewer that's going to keep the victim whole, and can really do the job, some of the most rewarding cases I ever had in my career came directly phone calls from community-based advocates to me. And that is not something that would have happened the first half of my career, Josh and Michael. But I'd like to think that when I figured it out and formed those professional relationships, that the advocates would encourage the survivors. Hey, I know somebody, he's really good, hopefully. Would you give him a chance and sit down and talk to him? So I share that to anybody that's listening in the audience, that the advocates are on the front line of a lot of this. And if you develop a reputation of being victim-centered, trauma-informed, and can bring it on the investigative side, they will steer cases to you. They will encourage the survivors to meet with you. It's, for me, a no-brainer. It just took me a long time to get there, and I don't have a good reason other than the people that trained me never use advocates. Yeah. That's the way we always did it, the everybody's favorite saying. So,
hey, Matt, what motivated you to change, though? What was your, not change, but could kind of embrace that space of advocates and wanting to be better? What was it? Was it a person? Was it just self-reflection?
A little bit of that, but the big thing was I found myself in a position that was called the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Unit. And the vast majority of my victims or survivors were females, ages 18, 19, and 20. And it was often just going to be an interview at the student center. And a lot of times, the last time they were alone with a male, or, a stranger or not, something terrible happened. And I just felt like in that situation, if I could develop a really great relationship with the community-based advocates, I felt like I could help them. And by proxy, I knew that they could help me. So I kind of had the Child Advocacy Center background as a forensic interviewer back in the day, but those cases kind of came organically through the CAC, but the reporting rates are so bad at colleges that I just felt like the advocates, especially the ones who were on campus, that if they knew that I knew what I was doing, and if they knew they could trust me, that they would steer cases towards me. And I was right. So a bit selfish because I wanted to investigate those cases, but also I have some cases in my history that I'm not proud of, that I look back on that I could have been better at. And again, if something happened to one of my loved ones, I'd really like them in a soft interview room with a detective that knows what they're doing and an advocate.
Yeah. And I don't look at it as being selfish. I mean, you want to do better for victims, for survivors, for for society, for communities, to improve community safety. And I think that at the end of the day is, whatever your sort of motivation to, have more cases, go through a process of some kind, or something along those lines. I mean, I think it comes down to, a desire to improve community safety at the end of the day. And I think that's one of the noble things about the policing profession, is that so many people, I think, want that, that are police officers, detectives, even chiefs, um, so many people in law enforcement want that. But I think sometimes they don't know how to get it. They don't know, that there's even something out there. I mean, there are over 18,000 police agencies in the US, right? And most of them are small and or rural police departments. That it's not that they don't know what they don't know. Just like you were saying, there are cases that you wish you had back, sort of mindset, that you wish you'd done something differently. You just didn't know what you didn't know. And I have plenty of those myself, where it's like, oh, well, if I had done this differently on this case, I could have, maybe improved the outcome in some way, shape, or form. And it's, you like to think that you do the best job you can throughout your career, but I think the learning aspect, I think that's what separates people very often, is that, and that's how you make those connections with advocates or other folks, is that they see your desire to help more people. They see it come through. I know that's what happened in my case, but I think transparency is a big part of it too, where if you build those relationships and you have transparent conversations with them. I'm not suggesting having, a completely transparent conversation in front of a survivor, on this in that same way, but because you have to be careful with that. But having those conversations with advocates after the fact, building those relationships, I think that's a really important piece of it, because it lets them know that you see what's happening, and that what's happening, and that this is how we're going to work together to get there. And I think that that's a really important piece of the whole thing.
I do think what Matt said about tension and what you're just saying now about transparency, I think that's always going to be in the room, and it's working through that and figuring out how to build from that and grow from that.
Yeah. And I personally like it. I mean, I think that it's a positive thing that there's two different perspectives in the room. The advocate's role is simply the health and welfare of the survivor. The police officer, neutral fact finder, equal obligation to the survivor and the suspect in a lot of ways, but interested in solving the crime. And I like having that element there for me, because sometimes I'm so focused on, the elements of the crime, or focused on, the secondary crime. There's a person over here, and there have been times, hey, can we take a break? Matt, can we take a second? I appreciate that. I felt like it made me a better interviewer. Then I got to obtain more case facts, which made me, by proxy, a better investigator. It's working through that, like Michael said, and it's what professionals do.
Yeah. Well, and, in talking about then, all of these cultural pieces, and, how we institute change when needed. Notoriously, police officers, there are two things that we hate in policing. It's the status quo and change, right? So how do we, not just at the command staff level, but at the line level, how do we start to get that buy-in that this isn't just, the newest, catchphrase or, newest lingo that is out there that, it's actually meaningful and powerful and can help them as police officers. How do we get that message to them?
Um, for me, I really like something that Michael had done, which is roll call training to start. I think that, trying to do SLMS training with something like this or having people slide through a PowerPoint, I really like the idea of let's just start off with 10 minutes. Here's our community-based advocates from this area. Um, you know, make an introduction, maybe somebody that had a success story, the advocate walking through what they're allowed to do, walking through that they might have a soft interview room space at their brick and mortar location. I really, really like that as a starting point. And I just can't see a reason why, if you weren't a chief of police, you wouldn't sign a MOU and have a little ribbon cutting ceremony with your local advocacy group, whether it be domestic violence or sexual assault. I think it's just such a great starting point. Yes, there's differences we're going to work through and things of that nature, but I don't know what Michael's thoughts are, but as a starting point, I would love to take a community-based advocate that helped me get a successful conclusion on a case, and for 10 quick minutes, walk it through everybody and let them know it can happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely love roll call or these short, 5 to 10 minute training pieces you can do with law enforcement. I don't know if all agencies have roll calls anymore, or if they've, kind of switched to online or more virtual based things, but there's so many different ways to get little bits of information that are so impactful to the agency members on different levels. So Matt, yeah, I think you're right. And thank you for saying that about roll call. And I love the idea of raising voices, raise the voices of people with the experiences who the law enforcement agency has touched, in a positive way with a good, strong outcome, or in a way where it's a lessons learned in areas to strengthen. I mean, there's so many different ways you can go with this. But thinking more, if we're talking about agency change and not just on sexual assault cases, but for everyone in the agency, if we look at policy and creating a space where the agency members themselves are interacting with each other in a trauma-informed way, it's going to become more of a natural way of communicating with the community members and the people that make contact. So I do think there's creating the agency being trauma-informed big picture is going to help the health and wellness of the agency members themselves. So that's always kind of the spin you can put on this. It's almost like thinking about domestic violence. These comprehensive responses can increase officer safety as well. To me, trauma-informed responses on calls and in interactions with the public are going to help the health and wellness of the agency members. So really looking at it's a benefit for everyone. It's a benefit for the individuals connecting. It's a benefit for the community as a whole. It's a benefit for the agency.
Well, I think that's a really important piece that gets overlooked too, Michael, regarding the officer safety and wellness aspect of a trauma-informed approach. One of the key programs that we have here at the Memorial Fund is around officer safety and wellness, and about keeping people off of the memorial wall, right? We don't want to add names to the wall, and have to memorialize them in that way. We obviously we do, and we're, unfortunately there will always be more added, but the more we can keep off the wall, the better. And so when it comes to a trauma-informed approach, in my mind, that's a really important piece of an agency actually being trauma-informed is understanding it from an officer safety and wellness perspective. Matt, I don't know if you want to touch on that at all.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like we fall into these buckets of like warrior or guardian, and that somehow it makes you soft, or that's what the community-oriented police officers do, or the DARE officers back in the day. And listen, it's not that. Any other profession, you can be an amazing surgeon as a doctor and have great bedside manner. This idea that we can't train people to be both is, I don't subscribe to it. I believe in our vocation more than that. So I think it's just starts from day one at your academy that this is a standard. there's times we always have to tap into that warrior mindset. There's times we're going to have to get in and stop the killing, get into the school, stand up and, be physical. I understand that. But this is a different thing. This is a different category, this victim interview. And I believe in stoicism and things like that. But there are ways to put yourself in a position to do right by these disclosures. But that ethos, that style, that mentality needs to start from the top and at the beginning. But people can change too. I was all warrior for a long time. And, a lot of that was probably my age and kind of the kind of officer I wanted to be and what I viewed as being a good cop. And this certainly wasn't the list of stuff I planned on doing when I first started this profession. But the feeling and the success and the gratitude that you'll have as a police officer if you adopt this approach, it's not just a buzzword. It's the way the profession should be. And you're not going to sacrifice A to do this B. It's just an enhancement. It'll make you a better pro. And like Michael has said, and you have said, Josh, it translates to all things. And I'm not saying be soft. I'm not saying being pushed around. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying just taking a breath and understanding that this person that you're dealing with does not have the same upbringing, thought process, training, or life experience as you. It's not going to maybe go the way that you want it to go or think it should go. But that's irrelevant to whether or not it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, do you have any thoughts on officer safety and wellness based on what you've been involved with over your career?
Yeah, I just think, again, that some of these core principles, especially the ones that Matt was talking about, really will help the individuals in the agencies grow and understand and interact with the communities in a stronger way, which will help what Matt just said, that ending sentence there was, it might not go the way you want it to go. It might not be what you expect. These people come from different places and experiences, but just knowing that you can't control that, but where are you and what can you control, I think does help with the wellness of and health of interacting with these cases and people. But again, like I said, I think it's interacting with one another in the agency as well, and understanding that the people sitting next to you in roll call or in service are coming from different places and maybe have experienced multiple traumas in their own life, and understanding that they're bringing something to the table as well to you and to the people that they're working with in the community. So understanding how to meet them where they're at, I think that is what creates a space where we all respect and can communicate and just support one another.
Yeah. And I like what you said, Matt, about, it's not about being soft, right? It's about taking care of our sisters and brothers in arms, right? That, we need to take better care of each other if we're going to help anybody. And this being a noble profession, I think it's imperative that we shift our focus and thinking to how can we best ensure that we're all okay at the end of the day. I mean, we all talk about, being there to support each other, and that we're there for each other. But how many of us can honestly say that we, checked in, on somebody that looked like maybe they weren't doing well on a particular case, or, just having a really rough day. And it usually ends up looking like joking if we do, and, the person plays it off. But how many of us have pulled somebody aside and said, "Hey, are you okay?" Because that can be the difference between life and death, for that officer. And I think that at the end of the day, the trauma-informed approach, it starts to pull all of these things together, where we not only understand the victim's trauma, the survivor's trauma, the witness's trauma, the suspect's trauma, even, right? That they're experiencing. But it's also our own trauma, and processing that and learning from it so that we can do a better job and help more people. Because at the end of the day, that's why most people get into policing, is to help people. And I think that is an overlooked piece too often when we talk about a trauma-informed approach.
Yeah, I really like that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Michael. I was going to say, I really like that tie-in. I grew up, starting as a police officer at the age of 21 and, at the end of 1997, and you just didn't talk about it. And that stayed the way the majority of my career. I do like this approach to officer wellness. I like the employee assistance programs. I think it's a very positive thing. And I do think it will run and hopefully can run parallel to what the three of us are asking law enforcement to do. That now that we're giving them permission to look inside, giving them permission to reflect now and talk to people, this is essentially the same thing, but for your fellow man. And I do believe that some of the stoicism and some of the kind of just suck it up, for me personally, translated to my victim interactions, finding it difficult to show empathy and compassion because nobody was showing me any. Finding it difficult to show empathy and compassion to somebody that may have committed criminality on a previous call with me, because nobody was giving me a break on my 50th call for service of the day. It's not right. I'm just being honest with you on what I see as sometimes some of the challenges is difficult to treat somebody else when you feel like that you're not being validated or treated yourself. So it's a very smart tie-in, Josh and Michael, to these two things. And I believe that as I became more mature and more introspective and more in touch with those things, it by proxy made me better in dealing with the public.
Yeah, definitely. Age helps with that, Matt.
Age does help. Age and time. Yes. I don't know. Yeah.
What I was going to say is, so much of my training and technical assistance was focused on kind of that sergeant level, mid-rank, mid-level management. And I still feel like they are so critical to everything in the departments because they've got eyes on reports and response, and they've got the ears of the folks above them. Hopefully, there's all different ways and different departments, but they can provide so much mentoring and so much, we talk about accountability. Everyone has to be accountable, and that's true. But Josh, what you just said of checking in with your fellow, coworkers that's accountability too, just making sure we're all good, that making sure everyone's okay, making sure that we're bringing ourselves to work in a way that's healthy. So I do think that sergeant level, whether it's, sergeants or field training officers, FTOs have a big role in kind of bringing some of these messages to, especially the new recruits coming in. We have a lot of young folks coming in that are prime for really instilling some of these values and thoughts into their work now. So it's a great chance, and it's a great role in that mid-management to put some of these ideas and these principles into action, and to whether it's the calls they're responding to or with each other. So, but Josh, I love that idea of just checking in with each other. Like that's part of wellness of each other and with the cases and the investigations.
And something else you just said, Michael, too, about, officers coming in, the staff that we have coming in now, this is not a foreign concept to them either, right? Being, understanding trauma, going to counseling, all of these things, right? And I think it's one of the reasons why we sometimes run into problems with retention issues where, younger officers today know all of these things. They want to feel like they're in a safe environment. I mean, law enforcement is inherently a dangerous environment, of course, but when I say safe environment, I mean a culture that takes care of them, right? So you're putting yourself into these dangerous situations, but then when you're done, you want to feel like you're in a safe space, that you can openly talk about your, how you feel about something and all of these things. And I think that if agencies look at that as a part of retention, even, I think understanding trauma and implementing a trauma-informed response agency-wide could actually help with retention issues too. And I think that that's a place where we need to explore a little bit more, perhaps.
And the generations coming into law enforcement have lived through so much exposure to sexual assault in the media, right? Some major cases, the Me Too movement, they've been living with that from a very young age, coming into law enforcement. So it's going to, I think, look and feel very different of what they're bringing into the spaces than folks that joined departments 30 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate you both joining me for it. And I want to give you both an opportunity, just any final thoughts, maybe a piece of advice to agencies that are starting down this journey of becoming trauma-informed, maybe want to implement a standardized process, survivor-centered practices, just anything at all on your mind here at the end.
Michael, you want to go first?
Sure. I guess my final thing would be collaboration is key. We've talked a lot about partners and people to bring into the space to have conversations with, but definitely strategic collaborations and thinking outside the box of what those collaborations can look like. And assessments. There's so many great assessment tools out there to assess policy, training, response, report writing, interviewing, everything, really to step back and take a look at what's going on in the agency and areas that can be strengthened.
And Michael, you've had the opportunity to put a lot of those assessment tools together through the various grant programs that you've been a part of. So
yes.
Maybe if it's okay with you, we could share some information. I mean, we could share both your information because I think both of you, there are plenty of people listening that would want to follow up, on pieces of what you've talked about. So
absolutely,
both of you, we can add that. So Matt.
Yeah. So I would just say two things. The first thing being, we owe it to the citizens that we serve to get this right. I personally think these single-digit reporting numbers, we're going to be on the wrong side of history. I have been blessed with 3 children, ages 21, 19, and 17. And I really don't think they're going to put up with it anymore. I believe that they are more in touch with each other's feelings, more in touch with each other's mental health, much more than my generation was. So to my law enforcement, leaders out there, there's a chance to get this right. The second part of it is I can find no reason why we would not want to identify batterers and rapists. We don't want them to be police officers. They're one of the number one drivers of homicide on police officers. If you listen to Mark Wynn, he's got some amazing information about individuals that batter their significant other and the threat they pose to us in law enforcement. So the second side of the coin is identifying these perpetrators, hence the term victim-centered and offender-focused. It's an amazing opportunity. It's an unfished pond, essentially, in a lot of places to be great at this. And I'm living proof of somebody that did not think this was the way for me to get it right, to change a couple things, a couple minor tweaks. And like Michael said, collaboration is the way. This is a horrible crime. But the one amazing thing about it is there's so many amazing people that want to help you. You will not get Michael Rizzo's or Josh Bronson's or other individuals that want to help you with catalytic converter theft or all the other things we're dealing with, but they're amazing professionals that can help you get there. Use them.
Yeah, no, that's 100%. And a shameless plug for the podcast. Those of you that might want to go back and listen to some of the great information that Mark Wynn has. We did have Mark on as a guest a couple episodes ago. So I would encourage you to go back and take a listen to Mark and our other guests during that session, Bruce Bieber, where they talked about lethality in domestic violence cases, as well as officer perpetrated domestic violence. So really important topics to talk about. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us on this episode of Precinct 444. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Precinct 444. A huge thank you to our guests, Matt and Michael, for sharing your perspective and expertise and insights on how law enforcement can better serve survivors and strengthen investigative integrity. Remember, change starts with leadership, training, and a commitment to justice that prioritizes the needs of survivors. For more resources and to read more about standardization in trauma-informed practices, visit the link in our show notes. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed.